Welcome to Issues of Contemporary Politics with Dr. Brovkin. Today is July 26, and I am devoting this video to a brief survey of the dramatic events in Kiev, Ukraine. Now, there's pretty much a consensus in Western media that what is happening there are protests against corruption, and therefore all Western media is full of articles criticizing Zelensky for his action in abolishing the independence of anti-corruption committee, and that's pretty much where most of the discussion is. But in fact, it's a much more chaotic situation, and my purpose here today is to try to explain to you, my dear subscribers, the political situation, the composition of political forces in Ukraine, and try to provide an interpretation of what is happening, why it is happening, and what the possible outcome of this crisis is. So, just about 2 weeks ago, the leaders of the European Union were congratulating Zelensky on his appearance in Rome on the Conference of Restoration or Reconstruction of Ukraine. He was getting standing ovation. He was getting the support of the European Union and the Alliance of the Willing. Were planning all kinds of aid, and Germany was declaring its desire to pay for the Patriot missiles. He was absolutely on top of his power, and this is probably why he decided to move another step in consolidating his power, not only abroad through getting all these ovations and Patriot missiles and so forth, but also inside Ukraine. So this is where the crisis began, with his action, which he thought would consolidate his power. So what he did was he decided to pass a law, and he did pass it in the parliament, which is called Rada, which severely limited or pretty much destroyed the independence of the two organizations which had the prosecutorial power in struggle with corruption. Now, they were set up many years ago with the help of the USAID. Many of them had links to the Biden administration and to the European entities and leaders of the European Union, because European Union has these values, as we all know, to struggle with corruption, to support transparency, and the rest of it. So what Zelensky did, he passed this law which essentially subordinated these agencies to the Prosecutor General of Ukraine, which essentially means to the presidential office, because the Prosecutor General is under direct control of the presidency. So the political significance of this action was very clear. It was a centralization of power. He was basically trying to subordinate the judicial branch and any investigations to himself. Why is that important? Was because there's lots of cases going on, and it is widely known and accepted in the West that Ukraine is one of the most corrupt countries in Europe. Now, let me explain a little bit, because the word corruption doesn't mean much unless you explain what it is. Now, corruption means a most concise definition is use of public office for personal gain. And that's been going on in Russia in the 90s, and Putin has done some work against it, but also in Ukraine on a massive scale. What that actually meant in the beginning was that all these Soviet enterprises and all these factories and all these resources were divided up by a group of oligarchs. This is why they were called oligarchs. Now, the example would be robber barons in the United States in the 1890s. Now, what was peculiar about about Ukraine is that with each president, and they had several since the days of independence, there was a redivision of property. Each new president was pretty much like a king who would give away contracts and companies and the influence and the flows of money to his favorite men. And this was like a clique, pretty much like a dictator giving away positions of authority, or if you want, a kind of a mafia boss giving away positions of power, and money flows. So this is what happened in Ukraine several times in 2000, 2006, 2014, etc., etc. However, some of the oligarchs kept some of their money, such as former President Poroshenko. He kept his chocolate business, and another one is Kolomoisky. He also kept a lot of his assets. Another one, Akhmetov, and so on. So there's this group of powerful businessmen, and they're called oligarchs, who felt threatened by the consolidation of political power by Zelensky. Moreover, Zelensky went on the offensive. He not only subordinated the anti-corruption organizations to his power, he also began to directly threaten these oligarchs, such as there was a restriction put several months ago against Poroshenko, the former president, the oligarch, the business who has huge business with chocolates, a so-called chocolate king. And also against, there was a case prepared with him, accusing him of receiving money from Russia. So Poroshenko felt in danger. He felt that now that prosecutorial office was completely in the hands of Zelensky and his prosecutor general, he may actually wind up in jail. Now, Kolomoisky is already in jail, and his companies were being grabbed by Zelensky and his people. Now, on top of all this, just about last week, what Zelensky did was a reshuffling of his cabinet. And some people were demoted, other people were promoted, but the bottom line of the specialists is that Zelensky strengthened his power and that of Yermak, his chief of staff, and weakened the power of those who had contacts with Zaluzhny, who was the commander of the army, and now he's an ambassador to England and presumably one of the candidates for presidency if elections were ever held. So what happened was that these people felt threatened. And once this law was passed, they went into action. So that answers us the question as to what it is and who is behind it. What it is a struggle for power between Zelensky, who's trying to centralize his power, and the opposition. And by opposition, in this case, we mean the oligarchs. And that is Poroshenko, Kolomoisky. Now also linked to them is the mayor of Kiev, Klitschko, and possibly in the shadows is the contact with Zaluzhny, an ambassador to London. Now, what unites these people and what are they in the political spectrum of forces in Ukraine? These are nationalists. These are Banderovites. They have no ideological differences with Zelensky whatsoever, except that they could claim that they were nationalists first, before Zelensky, who was actually elected on the platform of serving the people and making peace with Russia. But that's a separate story. So these people, when people look at the protesters in Kiev and in Lvov, these are the kind of people who voted for Poroshenko, and he led them out to protest. So if both of these camps, Zelensky's and Poroshenko's, are against Russia, are for the war, are for the West, are for Euro integration, what is the problem between them and Zelensky? The problem is power. They believe that Zelensky is out to destroy them. they believe that they want to that he wants Zelensky to consolidate his complete control and to make it impossible for them to run in elections against him if these elections are held, and they have to be held at some point, especially if ceasefire is reached. And so therefore they decided to act now, before they are in jail, before they're completely expropriated, and before they lose any political influence. So from their point of view, it was a self-defensive action to bring the people out into the streets. Now, that in itself is not such a big deal, because, well, everybody hoped that they would come out and then they would talk and have some rallies, and then it's going to fizzle out themselves. And that may still happen. But at this point, Zelensky made another step, which is he got scared, and he declared that next week the Rada would restore the independence of these judicial bodies, and they would be again independent in their pursuit of investigations of corruption. Now, that act is very important because it actually showed that Zelensky blinked first, to put this in a cowboy terminology. It means that he got scared, that he went too far, and that he actually made a retreat. And that usually means that those who felt fearful now feel encouraged. And the protests actually strengthened and are now involving more people. Now, what other people? What we need to understand that in the political spectrum of Ukraine, these nationalists are only one part, and by far not the most significant one, because all the people who voted for Zelensky to fight corruption and to be in democracy and to establish peace while moving towards Europe. These people are still there. Moreover, there are many people who are very angry with Ukrainian authorities for the TCK, which means for the recruitment agencies who grab men on the streets. And now, since there's a state of emergency, there's no way anybody could make any protests against TCK or against the mobilization or grabbing people on the streets. But you could now join and protest against corruption. So the protest against corruption become a kind of a banner or unifying platform for everyone who wants to protest against Zelensky. And that is why, if in the first days of the protests there were slogans, "We're not lohi," which means we're not fools, you can't fool us. Now there's more and more out of Zelensky to retire or to be gotten rid of. So this means that there are new forces that are joining in that struggle. Now, possible ways of action of both camps in this situation. Now, Zelensky is likely to get a step back in order to continue his offensive. In other words, he has already revealed himself as someone who wants to get rid of Kolomoisky, Poroshenko, Zaluzhny, and others. In other words, the war has been declared. Now, they will not believe him if he now steps back and says, well, now we're going to live in peace. No, they're still going to be fearful for their property and for their lives and political influence. And in my judgment, it is inevitable that the struggle between the two continues. Now, in this political context of the Russian advances at the front line, in the crisis of supply of energy and of the war material and the air defense systems from the West, it seems to me very unlikely that the crisis would just fizzle out and everything would return to the way it was before the crisis, which means at the time of June, early July 2025. What is likely to happen is the consolidation of the nationalist opposition in one camp, which will then they decide who it is going to be in the top of the ticket, Zaluzhny or Poroshenko or both of them, with the support of Kolomoisky. We shall see. But what is totally clear is that the Russians and the Americans and the Europeans would want to get rid of Zelensky and have new elections. And in these new elections, the nationalist forces hope to promote one of their candidates, and the names I have already mentioned. That is, if the situation stays under the control. If a situation stays under control, then indeed Zelensky's prospects are very high of losing power in a peaceful way through elections to this nationalist group. However, the situation may sort of skid out of control if indeed a lot of other people who are not in the nationalist camp join into the political struggle, all those angry with the mobilization, all those angry with the war, and it may lead to the unraveling of the political regime. Let me just give you one comparison. In October 1916, there was a group of people in Russia around Professor Milyukov, who becomes later foreign minister of the provisional government. And these people were nationalists who thought the Tsar was not doing a good job in leading the war. And so they made a conspiracy with the general staff to remove the Tsar from power in order to fight the war better. Now, the result, of course, we know, was a complete collapse of the Tsarist authority and with it of the Tsarist state, total chaos, and the coming of power of Bolsheviks, the most extreme minority power that nobody thought had any chances in the normal course of things. So I'm not saying that this is what is happening in Ukraine, but this is one of the possible scenarios, because the ruling elites think that they have everything under control, but there are a lot of unseen forces, and many of them are pro-Russian. Many of them are now silent, who, once the crisis gets out of control, Ukraine may be rolling to a complete collapse of authority with unpredictable consequences at the front and in terms of domestic situation in Ukraine. We may be witnessing the beginning of the collapse of Zelensky regime. Thank you very much, and I hope to see you soon with another edition of Issues of Contemporary Politics with Dr. Brovkin. And don't forget that I have many other playlists. I have playlists on Russian history and Soviet history, of post-Soviet history, on World War I, World War II. Just look at my playlists if you like, and subscribe. Thank you. Goodbye.